Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Camp Capstone. I am your host, Chris Whitpan. I am here today with Mr. Ian O'Toole. Welcome, Ian. How are you doing today?
Hey, Chris. I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for, connecting and making some time this morning. Now, because we have timey-wimey going on. You're actually in tomorrow when we're recording this because
Yeah.
you're in Australia, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, on the West Coast.
Right. So that's like not even like a little. It's very confusing when I was just talking to people in New Zealand. Now we're like, is that 2-3 time zones away? Australia's big.
Yeah, it confuses me. Yeah, it's pretty big. Yeah. I still get confused about it.
So you're probably closer to India than you are to our West Coast at this point. I think that would be fair to say.
Ooh. Yeah,
I'm
probably.
Yeah, just trying to, because Australia's as big as the United States, and it's an island, so it's
Yeah.
And usually when we talk to people, everybody always just thinks like, Golden Coast and Sydney and Bundaberg and all those, kind of areas and down there by New Zealand. But you got to cross this very large, vast desert, past this really big rock, and then keep going, and eventually you'll get to Perth. And going. There's a reason why there's trains and a lot of flights across Central Australia, right?
Yeah.
But you're not originally from Australia. You're not native. You're actually an expat. So where did you hail from originally?
Ireland. Wicklow in Ireland.
Outstanding. And you just decided the lush green grass was just too much for you? Couldn't handle it anymore?
Yeah, that's right. We moved out here 13 years ago now.
Okay.
Yeah, but my wife has family out here. We wanted to change, basically. No big dramatic reason, but yeah.
Well, there you go. I mean, if you have the option, it's a nice place to visit, I can imagine. So,
yeah, we're still here, so that's good. Yeah,
exactly. There you go. So, you have been now. I also anybody who's heard any of your interviews, we tend to get into this little battle over artist, illustrator, and graphic designer, because I know that you kind of don't necessarily like to be called an artist, but you do both illustration and you do graphic design, but you also create original pieces. So do you want to maybe tell us why you kind of struggle with that?
It's I guess a little bit of a rabbit hole.
We like rabbit holes.
Yeah. The word artist is just so loaded for me. It comes with a lot of baggage.
Okay.
An artist produces art, which has even more baggage, and I don't. It's a practical, like, I mean, I don't have it. It comes down to what you define art as, I guess.
Okay.
But I think when people start assessing work as art that's not necessarily prepared as art, then they put sometimes undue focus on it in certain areas. Does that make any sense?
It does, because
I never have any issue with people looking at something that I create and saying, that's art, that's fine, that's for other people to decide. But
right.
I don't put it forward as art. I put it
Gotcha.
forward as commercial graphic design and illustration.
It's funny because, when there could be a bit of similarity. I'm a chef by trade. That's what I did and grew up. So whenever I cook, it's similar to art, right? It's very utilitarian. I'm not trying to make haute cuisine every single time I create something.
Exactly. Yes.
I make sloppy joes and mincemeat pies just like everybody else, right? It might be a little easier. I might know some shortcuts, but ultimately, it's just food. So,
right.
If you choose to see it as this big grandiose thing, then I get that. So I do understand. And the first time I heard that, I'm like, of course not. I have the box of Nemo's War hanging on my wall because I like it. It's good to look at. it's art to me. But, you know, then again, somebody who takes apart Monopoly and puts it in a frame, that's art too. So it's completely subjective. I
Right.
get that.
Yeah, I think art is not a very helpful word, to be honest. To say something is or isn't art, there's sometimes a bit of a value judgment there. And I don't
Fair.
really subscribe to that, personally. So
Do you get to charge more if you call it art? Is that?
no, if I did, I probably would call myself an artist.
But
If anything, I'd probably charge less as an artist.
right, because artists aren't famous until they're dead, and that's just not
That's
part
right.
of your work ethic right now.
Yeah.
It's, you know,
No,
fair enough.
No, starving is not my style.
Fair enough. So that brings us to the commercial art, which is really what this kind of falls down in. You know, whether somebody's designing billboards or they're doing any of that, that is the work of a commercial artist, right? Like they are literally just designing something to be made for profit, right? Now, did you go to school to do that, or did you? Well,
yes, yeah.
yeah.
I studied, visual communications
Okay.
was what it was called, which is it was all sorts of things: graphic design and photography and
Mm-hmm.
printmaking and all that sort of stuff. Yeah,
Now, one
But
of the
it's a real learn on the job work, though. Unfortunately,
well, it's one of those things that, you know, and I think cooking can be, and I'm not trying to just draw parallels, but it kind of makes sense, right? Like you come out with a core knowledge, but where you go
Yes.
and where you specialize will kind of determine, you know, your specialty in your field, right? Like if somebody goes and does advertising,
Yeah.
that's one thing, or
I think it's similar for any practical. Sorry, practical is the wrong word. Any applied skill,
okay,
where the third level, like the college or university environment, is far more nurturing, I guess is the word, as it should be.
okay,
Right, so you know, you know, for instance, for us, we would have a project where we had to do maybe a corporate identity or a poster or something, and when we would have maybe a month to do it, you know, a month or 2 months to do it. Whereas your first job, you know, once you get out of college, you've got like a day to do it.
exactly.
So, that's the difference, really.
Yeah, you have a day and you have to produce like 5 options, like because you
Right. Yeah.
you have to show complete packages and things.
Yes.
So what made you what were your beginnings then when you came out of university and you started working? Because it's not like you came out and went straight into board games, correct? You came out and did some other things first.
Yeah, I did almost everything else first. Corporate design, advertising. I did not interior design, but I guess commercial interior design. Like I designed museum exhibits and trade hall exhibits and stuff like that. I did a bit of illustration here and there. All sorts. I worked as an art director for like 6 years.
Interesting. Yeah, art director. My brother does that. That's a very tireless job because you just have to tell everybody. And I don't know about you, but it's very hard for me sometimes to convey what's in my head and get it out, even if I can draw and things like that. And the tendency to want to over micromanage, or you know, this is my vision, and being able to let go. That's difficult for me. Did you find that challenging in that role?
Well, yeah, it can be. When I was working for an art director, I was also operating as a designer in that studio, so I wasn't, you know, completely just from an overseeing perspective. But I mean, I'll be honest. Also, the type, it was very commercial work that we used to work on, so we weren't dealing with any big concepts, let's say.
Right.
You
Fair
know,
enough.
so from that point of view, it wasn't that difficult. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and an art director trying to communicate things that there's no reference for yet. You know.
What do you think if you look back on that chunk of time and the advertising, what was maybe a project that you like vividly remember or look back fondly of, or enjoyed the fight of getting it out of your brain and onto a physical product? Like what was one of those for you?
I designed an entire museum gallery
Wow.
for the Army Museum here in Western Australia. They have a post 1945 gallery, which is basically post World War II up to the present day. It's like 3 rooms. So I designed it, I pitched it, I did the concept work, I did all the graphics, I did all the illustration, I did all the animation. Like I animated battle
Wow.
schematics and all these information graphics. So that was like a 9-month project probably.
And that was just the pitch.
Yeah, that's right. No, the pitch was a few very, very late nights.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So that was, I mean, it was really hard because it was a lot of work.
Sure.
But it's pretty rewarding. It's still there, so I can still go see it. I haven't now in quite a while, but it is still there.
That's very
It's a permanent
tangible
installation.
Yeah, a lot of people don't get something so permanent to kind of like look back. Like I was expecting maybe you did a Johnny Walker ad that was just kind of amazing. And it just
No, no. It was also nice from a people perspective because I got to connect with a lot of the vets and talk to them about their experiences and all that sort of stuff. So from that point of view, it was pretty interesting as well.
That's amazing. It's definitely, I think, everybody's dream to do something that has an impact beyond our little scope and our little world, but to have something that is permanent and may actually affect people. I mean, it's not something we think of as like a commercial art design project, but certainly next time you go to a museum, look around. There's a lot of it there.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
A lot of graphic design.
It was great. Yes, yeah. It was one of the few projects that kind of encompassed everything that I like to do. And because I was the only designer on it, I could kind of lead the client into, I could lead the client more than I would normally be able to.
Right. Because you didn't have to win over a team first. You just had to win over them.
Right. Yeah. And they were really good clients as well. So yeah, it was a good project.
Yeah, next time you go to a museum, we just opened one in Philadelphia, the Revolutionary Museum. That's really amazing. And I remember walking around because, I think it's kind of the job of the graphic designer is to convey information. And talk about a place that has a ton of information. It's a museum. But, I remember vividly some of the wall diagrams and the way things are laid out, even font choices to make sure it's readable for a wide variety of people. There's a lot that goes into that. It's amazing. I didn't know that. Huh.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. No, it's nice. It's fun work.
Absolutely. Now, when did you kind of make that turn? When did, the first board game start to roll in? And how did you kind of say, this is enjoyable, this is fun? Maybe it's not. I don't know. I'm assuming it is if you keep doing it.
Yeah. It was, let me think, probably about 8 years ago now.
Okay.
Is that right? That sounds about right.
2012.
I'm so bad at dates. I'm sorry. So please don't check me on any of these facts. I started to work for myself, and I was still doing lots of exhibition design work, which is primarily what I did before I started working for myself. So for trade shows and things like that. I reached out. I put some stuff on Board Game Geek because I wanted to do a bit more illustration work. I was playing a lot of games at the time, and I was trying to diversify client bases and stuff like that.
Sure.
So I got a couple of bites from that that were received fairly well. But the main sort of thing that projected me into doing it more seriously
Hmm.
It was a couple of things. In the same year, I did um, The Gallerist, Nemo's War, and A Study in Emerald, second edition,
That was
which
your
were
freshman
the
year.
three. Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe not the first year, but yeah, something like that.
Very
In the
early.
same year,
Wow.
they came out. Yeah, um, and I fell into all of the literally all three of those jobs in a fairly haphazard way,
Wow.
um, just through luck and putting myself out there. Um, and once they came out and they were pretty well received, it just kept going from there.
Wow. I mean, it's amazing because I remember the first time like I saw Gallerist was one of the first pieces that I ever saw because it was big, and we happened to be one of the playtest groups up here that was playing it. So I
Oh wow,
had
okay,
like we were playing it on the little cardboard cutouts. So to see it go from that
yeah,
and how you kind of even back then you were starting to streamline iconography and things like that because
right,
making a Vital game readable is you're one of the only people who can make that happen. Like I think you quite literally might be the only person who's actually ever going to be able to make that happen. Uh, it's just so much going on. But so
yeah, yeah.
how do you approach those big projects with so much information to convey? Like where do you begin?
I begin with playing the game
Hmm.
basically, and that usually throws up a whole load of questions because they're prototypes, so they're usually not finished,
Mm-hmm.
and the rule book's not finished and all that.
Right.
So that usually throws up a whole load of questions and things that are confusing, and that's usually a really good place to start. Just what were the barriers to us playing this game,
Okay.
and figuring out a way to sort of address those. And early on, the big questions that I'm looking at are things like how can we? It doesn't even come near iconography or anything like that yet. It's more ergonomically, how can we streamline this?
All right.
Can we take away this bunch of tokens and make it a track?
Hmm.
Um, can we save on setup by not having? Uh, I mean, a good example. If you think of everyone's favorite Castles of Burgundy.
Sure.
Uh, so if you think about, I'm not sure how familiar you are with that game, but there
Very.
are so there are kind of like achievement tokens that you can claim in the game if you
Right. Like
complete
all the
all of your
shipping and the
animals or all of
provinces.
your
Yep.
shipping first. Yeah. So and you take this little tile. Um, so something that I would look at is, well, those we don't need those tiles because they just need to be on the board, and if you give every player little markers, when they claim them, they can just place a cube on that space, right? So what that does is it saves on setup time because you don't have to sort out those things and you don't have to put them on the board. It doesn't necessarily save on components because you're swapping one component for another, but sometimes in certain circumstances, replacing a track, replacing a big pile of tokens with a track. It can save on table space sometimes. So that's all of those sort of decisions where you think, well, how can we remove all these barriers to playing this game, and especially with a heavy, like a big game,
Right.
that's really important. What can we take out from a gameplay perspective, but what can we retool to
Right.
make it more of a gradual unfolding as opposed to you have to sit here for half an hour and set this thing up.
So it just brings me right back to, what would I already know the answer is what would you most want to remake a game of? And it's the one you just mentioned. It's Castles of Burgundy because I've heard you say that before, and now I want you to redo it
Yeah.
even more than I have in the past. But
Yeah,
unfortunately,
I would really like to. Yeah. Yeah.
they're killing me.
I like the games. I play the game so much that it's probably in my head more because
Sure.
of that. If you know what I mean, it goes around in my head a bit more.
But there is
Yeah,
something to be
it
said.
would be a fun one to do.
Right. There's something to be said about streamlining that setup so that you can get into the teach and the meat right away. right? Like you don't
Yeah,
need
I
a
mean
ton of
that's
people
not
setting up.
a you know, I only use Castles of Burgundy there because I figured more people will be familiar
Sure,
with it. That's not a huge setup's a bit of a pain in Castles of Burgundy, but most of it's unavoidable. Most of it is part of the game.
sure.
So that wouldn't really that's not really that big an issue in the way the current edition's done. But certainly in some bigger games, then yeah, those issues, not issues, but that approach can really save some time. The biggest one I think that was the game that I've worked on that was affected the most by this was probably Stevenson's Rocket,
Okay, interesting.
um, which is very very different than the first edition. It's the same game, but
Right.
what you do to mark that you've done something is very very different. So
Hmm.
the first edition had money. It had paper money, which is not great. But also you never spent the money, so that just became a points track, right? So you can never
Sure.
spend it. There's no point in making change and shilling. It makes no sense. And then there were also all of these little tokens that you had to put out onto the board in stacks, and at the start of the game you had to sort them into, I think, 6 or 9 different types, and it was just a pain.
Right.
It was a big pain. Um, and so that basically became a grid on the board where you do exactly what I said. You mark it as you take it. Um, and the benefit of that also is it's much easier to look and see what everyone has,
Mm-hmm.
the totals, and because there's a majority thing involved in that. So it has a gameplay
Right.
bonus as well as just having zero setup, less components. So the game is exactly the same game. The decision space is exactly the same, but it's just a cleaner product.
Handled
basically.
differently. Interesting. So
Yeah.
you did get a crack at redoing something that was super complicated, and with Kanban in the second edition, the EV edition, that's
Yes.
coming soon at this point. What kind of challenges did you face? I mean, because that I won that game by like 100 points, and I still to this day don't think I could tell you exactly how I did it, because
Yeah.
there's so much going on. How did you work to try and maybe, I want to say clean it up, because it was pretty clean but kind of streamlining.
So the couple of things in Kanban that we identified early. First thing is the main thing is the sort of demarcation of the board. So
Mm-hmm.
separating what the different departments are and making that really really clear.
Gotcha.
The other thing is every department has a few actions you can take. A different number of actions you can take. But
Right.
there's also a certification track, which is kind of standard, at least in format, standard in each department. But in the old version, that certification track is kind of in a different place. It's on the right or the left, or for each
It's just,
department. So
down in the office
it's not
area.
standardized.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the first thing that I did was kind of make almost like a lobby area to each department,
Hmm.
and that houses the certification track, and it also houses basically your action icons. So
Okay.
when you look at each of the departments, and each of these lobbies looks exactly the same. When you look at each of these departments, you can see exactly what you can do in that department, and the certification track is always in the same place. So it helps during the teach, because you can just teach that as an overall
Right.
um, as an overall visual cue to how you play the game. Convention. Overall convention is the word I was looking for.
Works for See, we forgot about conventions already. So
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So that was the main thing. The other thing is the scoring is quite in depth in Kanban,
Yeah.
especially because you've got end of week scoring and you've got all these different things. So making that clearer and what scores when was also important. So on your player board, you have these things where you have parts, but then you have tested parts, which are different. And tested parts score you points, whereas other parts don't necessarily. So just on the player board, how they're arranged and where they're put and how they link up to the cards that they match
Right.
and stuff like that. So there's little graphic representations of that. All that sort of thing. The meeting room was tidied up a lot. It still has the effect of a meeting room, but it's more like you're kind of giving it visually looks more like you're giving presentations as opposed to just a big giant table. We removed the little chair tokens that are super fiddly.
Yep.
And I also looked at the actual meeting cards. I think, I hope, I believe, are now much easier to understand as you play the game, as opposed to, that was one thing that I always found with teaching, is people got confused by the way that they work mechanically.
It's really hard to, put that out there and give it to somebody, and then, by the way, how does my end of game scoring work for this card? And you're kind of like, well,
right.
It's private information, but here you can read this book. If you can kind of get past that, it's so good.
There's still lots of icons. It's still a complicated game. There's still lots of icons, and there's still a big teach. Nothing's going to change that. But again, it's removing those barriers to entry of if you understand the icon. The problem that was with the previous edition is people didn't still fully understand the card. Right. So they understood what the card was looking for. So we want red cards, for instance.
Sure.
But they didn't understand how mechanically it worked during the game, like how much you'd score and how many times you can score and all that sort of stuff. So hopefully all that is much clearer now.
Well, I'm excited. I feel like every third Vital game I really like and get. The Gallerist was one, Lisboa is one. Escape Plan I loved, so I think this is probably going to fit in that niche. I like the other one, but again, sometimes when you have to relearn the game and reteach the game every time you bring it out, if we can kind of cut that out, that's great. Awesome. I love it.
Yeah, I learned them so much during development that the rules are permanently lodged in my brain.
Good or bad, I don't know, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
So let's venture into, here we are. We're actually at Capstone, and we'll actually start to talk about a Capstone title. So, I believe, which came first, Irish Rails or Age of Steam? Irish Gauge. I'm going to do that. I'm sorry. In your world, in published world.
Yeah, you put me on the spot now. I think it was Irish Gauge.
Okay.
I don't know. They were quite close together. I think it was Irish Gauge.
I do believe they were kind of like they were releasing right around the same time. But I also know, like, Age of Steam was kind of a longer drawn process because you also did multiple maps for that at the same time. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So
the Age of Steam project for me wasn't that long, but I know that the road to getting it back in print and all that was quite long.
All that stuff being what it is, we'll just talk about the art side of it. So what was it like taking? Come on, there are a few times we can literally say the word franchise. And actually mean it. And I think Age of Steam probably falls in that boat, or rides that train, as it may be. How did it feel kind of having to shepherd that into, the 2020s and make it a beautiful but very, very simple kind of design? Like, I love that. So how'd you approach that?
Age of Steam, I actually found Age of Steam a fairly straightforward, easy project to work on, because I went in with a very clear end goal in mind. So I talked to a lot of Age of Steam players, because I'm not a huge Age of Steam player myself. So I talked to a lot of players about what they would want from a new edition and what they, more importantly, wouldn't want from a new edition. And they were pretty unanimous in what they wanted and what they didn't want. And it would be no surprise to learn that they want artwork kept clean. They don't want plastic trains. They just don't want noise. Visual noise is basically
Right.
what they don't want, and that's also what kind of the direction that I wanted it to stay in or to go in. So for me, it just became a process of making it look clean and balanced and attractive, but again, not overly embellished. The main change that I made was in the actual the boards. Not the map boards, but the gameplay boards, whatever you want to call those.
Right.
And again, this comes down to me trying to make the game easier to teach.
The loan track, the bid boards, and all those things.
Yeah. So
yeah. Okay.
Right. So in the previous edition, there were two boards basically, that had each of those phases in a sort of a random order. So here's your engines, and here's your loans, and here's your goods, and all that stuff. They were kind of organized for space rather than sequence of play.
Gotcha.
So the obvious approach to me seemed to be to just put those in sequence of play. So if you're teaching the game, you can go, okay, we start here, and then we count down, and once we get to the end, then we go back to the start again as the next round. So that alone makes the teach easier, because you're not looking around to find what you're doing.
Yeah.
The other thing I did was so the costs of everything, the sort of reference board for the costs, is it fits in with everything, but it's its own separate board. So it can be removed if you are an old school Age of Steam player and you know the costs inside out. You can just take that board out and you can save some table space. And that's that. But other than that, it was just down to keeping it clean. That's basically it. Color choice, things like that.
So switching over to the Irish gauge, there's a couple things that I enjoy. One of the things, and I think this is kind of subtle in most of your designs, is that you have a very specific kind of saturation of color for that game. It's almost like you say, this is the level for this game, and that's how deep we're going to run. So it has a couple benefits. Like, you're able to mix a lot more colors, because now you're just blending across a flat spectrum, and they seem to blend and really work together, which is why Ride the Rails and Irish Gauge look perfect next to each other. Like, they just because you have matched that so well. Is that something you consciously go in when you start choosing color palettes for these and things like that? Is where do you kind of begin your process with that?
It's just to an extent, to be honest. The Ride the Rails games are again pretty minimalist. The boards, the components, there's not a huge amount going on purposefully. So the boxes are really the opportunity to sort of give it a draw and
right.
Make the whole package a bit more desirable and attractive. As regards the color, I mean that style is kind of based on a certain style of sort of printed railroad posters, sort of, and the rendering style certainly is. So it's kind of based off that, I guess. So the colors are slightly muted, but I also knew that. So Irish Gauge was developed obviously as the first in a series, so I had to think about it as an ongoing series. So the format of the illustration on the cover is a locomotive in profile, a landscape behind it, and the text sort of on the landscape but not in the sky, in the landscape. Right. So that was developed very purposefully as a repeatable composition, right? So the composition of Ride the Rails is exactly the same. It's a different train, it's a different landscape, the color is different, but where things are and how they're placed in the balance
Yeah, you
is exactly the
captured
same.
Fallen, Pennsylvania, so you nailed it for me.
Right, right. It's good. I've never been there, so that's good. It's good to hear.
Yeah, you totally got it. So, do you take
Yeah.
how deep do you like research those locomotives? Because, for instance, I play a lot of 18XX. That's what we do. And
Yeah.
if the wrong train is running in the wrong company, that is going to cause some problems. So, how deep do you kind of like research, make sure you have something that makes sense?
Very deep. So all of the locomotives are real locomotives
Cool.
um, that ran in an appropriate time period. Where there is some artistic license taken is in the backdrops. They're
Sure.
not. They're more sort of an amalgamation of different sort of evocative parts of the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that particular train may not have run past that particular piece of
Right.
scenery because that particular piece of scenery doesn't exist.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, as regards to locomotives, they are specific trains. Yes. Yeah.
Interesting. And you know what? I think that that's kind of important too. With all the train games, it's not about recreating history. It's about kind of creating alternate histories and timelines. And
Right.
what happens if this company never forms or this company becomes the big dog in the street? So, they're all kind of,
Yeah.
whether how far they're abstracted out is kind of different for everything. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So we're going to be talking in the next show coming up about what the three is going to be. Do you have a color in mind? Is there anything that's kind of speaking to you right now, like that maybe we can kind of think about? I don't know how far you've gotten to work on it
Not,
yet, so I don't necessarily want to.
not really.
But I'm just curious.
I am in early stages at the moment. So I've just gotten through the research
Excellent.
proportion of that, and with the help of some very helpful people online who are far more knowledgeable than I am about historical locomotives.
But now you have a great resource going forward too, I'm sure, right?
That's right. That's correct. Yeah, which is very, very valuable. Cannot be understated.
Because it's amazing.
It's a time sink.
Yeah, and you don't realize how much, there's a lot of minutia, but there's also not a ton of information like just searching on the web for these things. Like if you know a specific engine or line, that's one thing, but
Yeah.
generics, no.
Even just trying to find. I mean, I did a cover for Portuguese Railway. I can't remember the title of it. Anyway, I just did the cover, so
Right.
it was a Vital.
The map for Aegis.
Sorry, yes, not for Aegis Steam, for Railways of the World.
Yep, that's it.
And so I had identified a train, and I could see on Google Earth the route that it take. So I literally had to go into like the 3D Google Earth in 3D and try and find my viewpoint, my reference viewpoint of the bridge that it travels over. So it's amazing that I can do that sort of stuff.
Right.
That's available to me, that I can literally fly around the world, and that's a really fun part of gathering reference. But it can be a huge time sink. I went down a huge rabbit hole recently of looking at Victorian houses in London as reference for a different project. But I spent probably 4 hours just flying around London going, oh, that's a nice house, and taking pictures of it. Yeah.
Interesting. It's great that we can do that because it really truly opens up like the global marketplace, right? Like we can,
it's incredible.
In Western Australia can do that and do location scouting via Google Earth. That's great.
I mean, I seem to be visiting London a lot virtually recently, but I did another project which was like also a Victorian thing, and I just needed a backdrop that looked, right, basically. And it was great. You can basically fly around London in 3D and pick your shot and go, well, it's fantastic. It's amazing. It is. I don't know what people used to do with that.
So I have like one final product to talk about. Also coming out this year, you have Rococo coming out. Now, to me, like this one must have been a very interesting challenge because to me the game was great the way it was to the point where I'm like, do I need to upgrade it? Is it's not like tons changing, and Michael Menzel, is a good illustrator. So I don't feel like it was struggling on that front. We have Amanda tapping on the front cover, which is fine. But it could be worse. Could be Concordia. Let's be fair.
Right. Yeah.
But how was it to try and kind of reinvent something that wasn't a pile of garbage or a hot mess or completely difficult, but to come around and reimagine it again?
It was, it was good. Like you said, there's nothing wrong with the original edition at all. In fact, far from it. But it was just a case of identifying a couple of things that we could, little hooks, basically. And the main one, honestly, is that the original edition, while visually quite lavish and impressive, isn't very representative of the Rococo period.
Okay.
The style that you see, Rococo is a lot more airy and whimsical, lots of whites and golds.
Louis, right?
Yeah. Whereas the original edition is a lot of wood and it's darker and
okay.
Again, it's very lavish and it's warmer certainly, but it's not necessarily. And Rococo is a very distinctive period because it's off the wall. It's completely wacky. So that for me that was the immediate thing when I was like, well, I don't really need to change anything from a gameplay perspective,
right?
But I can certainly make it look more like Rococo.
All right, interesting. I'm excited to see that one too, because to me that's a top 5 game. Like we love that, and I'm curious to see the treatment. So excited for that.
Yeah.
So I always like to end these on trying to ask. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who maybe they just finished university, maybe they're just going in, and they kind of they're in love with this idea of the romance of board games and board game art, illustration and design. What kind of advice would you give to that person?
Wow, romance. What sort
you
of
play
advice?
games all day. Come on, it's
I do not. These are for display purposes only. What advice? Well, usually I would say make sure you attend conventions, which obviously is not very practical at the moment.
Sure.
But in a normal world, if you can, and they are expensive. Speaking as somebody who travels to Germany from every year. They are expensive, but there is no doubt in my mind that it is absolutely worth it for me.
Sure.
I only go to Essen. I haven't been to any of the ones in the US yet, or any other. So one a year is fine for me. But I would say conventions are a huge help if you can get to them.
Okay.
Other than that, I would it's just obvious, play lots of games and think about them from a product design perspective as you're playing them. It's iconography and all that sort of stuff is, just think about what it's telling you and where people slip up and why they might slip up and also just the production of the game. I don't mean the thickness of the cardboard and stuff like that, but just where things are placed and why they might have been placed there. All of that, all of those sort of broad design decisions.
Right.
I guess think about what you would change in games you've played, if given the opportunity to. Yeah, all of those things. Is a pretty big one.
Yep.
Yep.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, this has been a blast. I'm glad we were able to connect and, spend some time with you and, just get a peek inside your world because, you've touched a lot of games. I mean, I have that you have 73 titles listed on BGG, which is rather prolific. Now, granted, that's probably including every single expansion map and pack and everything. So, but that still probably means there's like 50 solid full titles in there that you have credit on, which that's a nice body of work. And you came out of the gate swinging. If you came out with, a Study in Emerald and the Gallerist right out of the gate, like that's just incredible. So, awesome.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to, hopefully getting to meet you at ESSA next year. Let's keep our fingers crossed. I think
fingers crossed.
Yeah, I was supposed to go this year. It was supposed to be my first year. I wanted doner
really?
kebab and
Yeah.
No dice, but we'll try and get there next year. So
yeah.
Thank you again so much for making some time. Enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully, things go well and we get to see a lot more of your work soon and we get to see the next Iron Rail coming out because we're kind of excited about that around this place. And maybe some other stuff you may have already heard about too, but that's different stuff in the pipeline. All right. All right. Thanks, Ian. Thank you, Hope, for watching. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.